Foxhole lore. It's mysterious, confusing, and the source of a tremendous amount of salt on Reddit. In fact, while doing my research for this deep dive into the lore, never in my life have I seen so many people who could really benefit from going outside and touching grass. It's uncertain why some people feel they have such a firm grasp on the lore, when the lore page itself has a quote from the devs basically saying, "We will not be giving you strict lore. Theorize as you may." That being said, before we dive into the lore of Foxhole, we'll need to lay a few ground rules and explain some issues within the lore. First, our ground rules. The purpose of this video is to give an overview of the Foxhole lore. We're not going into extreme details, like how on December 28th, Emperor Callahan scratched his left testicle using the pinch and twist method. We're not going to be discussing the minor factions, and we'll mainly be focusing on the main players, the Warden Empire and the Colonial Republic. The last thing I need to explain before we dive into the timeline is that the lore is intentionally a mess, and it's sparsely delivered. Not to mention, the majority of these sources are not primary sources, and could very well be propaganda. So take most of this information with a large grain of salt. Without further ado, let's get right into the history. Allow me to introduce to you the timeline, which I had first mistaken for the new LGBTQ flag. Like all stories, we'll start at the beginning. Setting. Foxhole takes place in an alternate universe. While there are many visual themes that seem to tie the armies of Foxhole and locations to our own universe, these are merely coincidental, though I will certainly be using real-life countries and timelines to give you a better idea of what these historical events look like. We begin here, in the stark blue zone known simply as the less sophisticated times. To my best estimate, these times are the equivalent of our own very late 1700s, just before the Napoleonic Wars. The Warden Empire at this time is protected by a great wall, known as the Bulwark. The purpose of the Bulwark was to defend the Warden Empire against hostile nations to its south. In this period, the Warden Empire is not concerned with the colonials, but rather a smaller nation to the south known as the Masayans. It's estimated that this is the period in which the great Emperor Callahan led the Warden Empire, due to the fact that the lore mentions Emperor Callahan was alive during the construction of the Bulwark. Emperor Callahan is a near godlike character within the Warden Empire. He's constantly referenced around the map, with entire zones named after him, and even statues of him by one of the bridges in the abandoned ward zone. Emperor Callahan is described as possessing both diplomatic and military prowess, and is viewed as largely responsible for the Warden Empire's prosperity and rich history. During this Dark Blue Zone, little is known about the status of the Colonial Republic, but we can assume that it was at least roughly technologically equivalent to the Warden Empire. Although the Warden Empire of the current day is entirely warlike, the Warden Empire of this period is known as a thriving trade empire, undergoing an era of expansion and prosperity within the confines of the map we're currently fighting over, known as Siva. In addition to growing the trade empire within its own borders of Siva, the Warden Empire at this period is also expanding and conquering nearby colonies. Now we move into our first Cyan Region. The Cyan Regions are an unknown period of time in which a cataclysmic event, usually attributed to war and destruction, caused a deterioration in technology and history. This universe is equivalent to a dark age. You might be wondering how technology gets lost during these periods of time of war, and I have an interesting theory that I'll be sharing with you during the next Cyan Region. Now let's move into the green section of the timeline. This period is a lead up to the Great War. For those who are unfamiliar, the Great War is the first and arguably the most brutal war between the Warden Empire and the Colonial Republic. Of course, it could be argued that the Great War never ended, and that current conflicts are simply an extension of the Great War, and by the end of this video, you should be able to decide for yourself whether you think that or not. Here's what we know. Both the Warden Empire and the Colonial Republic are undergoing a period of expansionism, and the two great nations' borders are meeting at more and more locations, causing a significant amount of friction and chafing. If it helps paint a picture, you can think of this time like the era of expansionism and empire building that led to World War I. The Colonial Republic is based mainly in the south and is aggressively advancing its territory northward, while the Warden Empire is expanding its empire southward. Various small border skirmishes occurred between the Warden Empire and the Colonials, with the Wardens seeking to stop colonial expansionism, and the Colonials constantly grasping for new territory. These border skirmishes were relatively small, but important in establishing the fact that the Warden Empire was technologically outmatched by the Colonials. It's speculated that the Warden Empire places great value in its rich history and traditions. When they expand and conquer new lands, they push their traditions onto the new people of the empire, whereas the Colonials, in their expansionism, are constantly taking the best ideas and technologies from smaller factions that they conquer. This theory is supported by the lore of the colonial light tank, known as the Hatchet, which states that it was engineered by a talented young man from one of the colonial city-states, known as Demiurg. This theory is also evidenced by the visual themes of the two major factions, with Wardens having blue uniforms, fashionable helmets, and armor that appears to be a throwback to the armor of a knight, whereas the colonial uniform is mostly utilitarian, khaki, rounded helmets, and armor that clearly favors function over form. Anyway, eventually these border clashes boil over into a proxy war. For those of you who are unfamiliar with a proxy war, it's a way for two large factions to duke it out by using two small factions. Here's an example. Me and my neighbor hate each other, but we don't want to come to blows, so we train our dogs to shit in each other's yards. This is our way of attacking each other without actually attacking each other. However, like every proxy war in history, it eventually boils over into real war between the main factions. An all-out war between the Colonials and the Warden Empire, with the Colonials being the aggressors and the Wardens attempting to hold on to their territory. We are now introduced to one of the main characters of the Colonial Legion, Legate Celis Maro, who leads the Colonials in a massive initial push northwards, ending in the destruction of key segments of the Warden Bulwark. This is a major loss for the Warden Empire, who had always seen the Bulwark as unbreachable, and most of their defensive strategies were based around the Bulwark. Legate Celis Maro's victory was shortly lived, as soon after the breach, during the Battle of the Abandoned Ward Zone in the Deadlands, the Wardens recognized his military genius as a major threat, and had him assassinated. Unfortunately for the Wardens, this activated Celis's trap card. Celis had a granddaughter named Thea Maro, who he recognized from an early age to be a strategic genius. Thea was trained by Celis, almost from birth, to take his place one day as legate of the colonial army. The assassination of Celis allowed Thea's military genius to be unleashed upon the Warden Empire. With the Bulwark in ruins, the Warden defense faced a series of grave defeats. This leaves us here on the timeline, in the brown section, where colonial forces, led by Thea Maro, ousted the Wardens from their ancestral capital in the Deadlands. But this is where the tables turn. Now we enter the purple area of the timeline, the brutal and destructive finale of the Great War. This period of the Great War is known as the Boreal Wars, as the colonial invaders had pushed the Warden Empire into the icy north of its homeland. For both factions, the worst of the conflict is about to begin. A promising new military leader emerges from the Warden Empire, and his name is Callahan. Not the same Callahan that helped found the nation and build the Bulwark, as that was over 400 years ago. This general just has the same name. Anyway, Callahan's military brilliance equals or possibly outmatches Thea Maro's. Despite the technological differences between the two factions, Callahan was able to stop the colonial offensive dead in its tracks, even pushing the Colonials out of some regions in a series of major defeats for the Colonials. It's important to note that during the Boreal Wars, the Warden technology made major advances and was almost comparable to colonial military technology of the time. That being said, if you're paying attention to the timeline, you'll notice we're about to enter another mysterious Cyan period. As I stated before, these Cyan periods are periods of unknown time, where some sort of disaster caused a relative dark age in terms of a regression in technology and historical knowledge. The difference between the previous dark age and this one is that we have a clear picture of what caused this dark age. The Boreal War lasted for many years, and now that the technological difference as well as the military leadership differences have been evened out, there was a stalemate between both great empires, throwing insane amounts of manpower and resources into the conflict, being rewarded with nothing but death and loss of wealth. This lengthy period of loss and destruction is one of the main factors leading to the upcoming Dark Age. And the other main cause of the upcoming Dark Age is the near simultaneous destruction of two massive stockpiles of technological blueprints for both the Wardens and the Colonials. The loss of Warden technology can be attributed to a massive strike on a secret Warden base within the Weathered Expanse region, which housed the vast majority of Warden tech knowledge. The near simultaneous loss of the Colonial tech happened when the Warden Navy destroyed the flagship of the Colonial blockade. The flagship was considered unsinkable and housed massive amounts of Colonial tech knowledge, in the form of blueprints. Following this unknown length of time in the most recent Dark Age, we enter the Yellow Era. This era is entirely player-driven, starting from War Number 1. You could argue that this is merely an extension of the Great War, or you could argue this is an entirely new war. Some theorize that each of these wars, driven by players, is followed by a short Cyan period where tech regresses. While there are many other theories, this is the one I choose to believe. At the time of this video, War 91 has just begun. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please comment, tell me your ideas and theories, and please subscribe to the channel. I'm putting out weekly gaming videos, not just Foxhole, I'm all over the place. Like, subscribe, and join the Discord, link in description. You won't regret it. But most importantly, have a good day.